The Reconstructionist Radio Podcast Network presents The Monstrous Regiment, featuring a roundtable of Dominion women seeking to honor Jesus Christ in applying God's Word fearlessly and faithfully in all callings and seasons of life, both in and out of the home, reversing the curse and smashing pagan strongholds.
We're all familiar with the concept of romantic love, but where does that concept come from? What are its underlying ideas? Is it something that we've always had, or is it unique to Western society? The French thinker Denis de Rougemont wrote a landmark book entitled Love in the Western World to discuss these questions, and today I'm thrilled to welcome Stephen Perks to the podcast at long last to go over some of what de Rougemont wrote about in his book. I'm Susanna Roundtree, and this is The Monstrous Regiment. Hello, Stephen.
Hello. It's nice to be here with you.
Yeah, I think you were one of the very first people I contacted back when we started this podcast to ask you to come on, so it's great to finally be getting around to it.
Yeah, it's been a while. I've reread the book since then, and it took me quite a while, but it's a great pleasure to be here.
Great. So this book deals a lot with medieval courtly love, and like a lot of thinkers, de Rougemont traces the whole Western idea of romantic love. He traces that all the way back to the courtly love ideal of the Middle Ages, and he points out that the ancient world did have a concept of passion, but they tended to view it as a kind of madness. Here's a quote from the book. He says, "In the East, and also in the Greece of Plato, human love has usually been regarded as mere pleasure and physical enjoyment. Not only has passion, in the tragic and painful sense of the word, seldom been met with there, but also, and especially, it has been despised in the eyes of current morals and treated as a sickness or frenzy." This whole notion of romantic love was not something that was present in the ancient world, and as we've mentioned before in this podcast, the ancient Greco-Roman culture had a very demeaning view of women. They would use words like sick and infirm, and so romantic love, I guess, as an urge to unite yourself with one of these infirm creatures would have been despised. And so it wasn't until the medieval courtly love phenomenon that a major civilization began to think of romantic love as something admirable and even sacred. So over the last 12 months, as I've been working on a novel which is set in the 12th century in the High Middle Ages when courtly love began to emerge as a big cultural phenomenon, I've been doing a bunch of research into some of this literature, especially the Arthurian romances of Chrétien de Troyes. Chrétien wrote his 4 stories between about 1170 and 1180, probably commissioned by his employer, who was a Countess of Champagne named Marie of France, and she was the daughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was a famous figure from that particular time period. So Chrétien was among the first writers to incorporate courtly love themes into Arthurian literature. He was, for example, the inventor of the whole Lancelot, Guinevere, and King Arthur love triangle, so he's a major figure in the literary tradition. His romances were also influenced by the troubadours of southern France, who were noble minstrels who became famous for composing passionate love poetry, and I think you're going to give us a lot more in-depth look at those men shortly, which I'm looking forward to. But there's a typical courtly love story from this period that I was reminded of as I was preparing for this podcast. It tells how the French troubadour Geoffrey Rudel heard of the beauty of Hodierne, the Countess of Tripoli. He fell in love with her from afar, and after writing her a great deal of passionate love poetry, he finally travelled east with the Second Crusade in the hopes of seeing her. Unfortunately, he fell ill, probably with love sickness or something, on the journey, and by the time he reached Tripoli, he was dying. And so when she heard the news, Countess Hodierne came down out of her castle to meet him and held him in her arms as he died. And so I thought this was a very typical look at the whole ideal of courtly love. You've got this lover who's so consumed by passion for a woman who is very far away and unattainable. She's usually much higher status than he is. He serves her by writing poetry or doing deeds of bravery in her name. The relationship gets... there's all sorts of difficulty and suffering and usually adventures because of the woman's social or marital status. And it usually ends with both of the lovers dying, or at least one of them. So you can think of Dante and Beatrice from the Divine Comedy, or the well-known knight and lady couples from medieval romance like Lancelot and Guinevere, or Tristan and Isolde. So Chrétien de Troyes' employer, Mary of Champagne, together with her mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, and several others, they're central figures in the creation of the courtly love tradition. And according to Marie's courtier, Andreas Capellanus, these women set up a, quote, court of love in Poitiers. It was designed to adjudicate lovers' quarrels and make rulings on questions of romantic love. And one of our major sources on medieval courtly love was Capellanus's list of rules, which he wrote down. According to him, these were some of the rules that the courts applied, and here are some of them. I thought I'd read them out. Marriage is no real excuse for not loving, and by that I mean, by that he meant even married people should have courtly love affairs with other people. He wasn't envisioning that the married couple would have a courtly love relationship with each other.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. Sorry. Can I? Yeah. That's interesting because, you see, according to de Rougemont, marriage and courtly love or love affairs are incompatible. It's not just that they can't go together. And given de Rougemont's theory, there's a reason for this, and it all goes back to the Cathars and their theology. But carry on with your list. I just wanted to make that point. Yeah, and
I really think this list of courtly love rules really supports de Rougemont's hypothesis. So marriage is no real excuse for not loving. Here's another one. When made public, love rarely endures. So you can see how that is as opposed to marriage. Here's another one. The easy attainment of love makes it of little value. Difficulty of attainment is prized. When a lover suddenly catches sight of his beloved, his heart palpitates. Real jealousy always increases the feeling of love. A slight presumption causes a lover to suspect his beloved. Well, that sounds nice and comfortable, doesn't it? He whom the thought of love vexes eats and sleeps very little. There you've got the suffering again. And a true lover is constantly and without intermission possessed by the thought of his beloved.
Yeah.
That's just some of the rules that I pulled out of my handy little portable medieval reader.
Yeah.
So for modern people, this can be pretty hard to take seriously, this idea that love is primarily about suffering flamboyantly for the sake of a lady you don't actually want to marry or even in most cases sleep with. And we see this in a lot of the medieval literature. Here's how Denis de Rougemont explains Tristan and Isolde. He says, Tristan and Isolde do not love one another. They say they don't, and everything goes to prove it. What they love is love and being in love. They behave as if aware that whatever obstructs love must ensure and consolidate it in the heart of each, and intensify it infinitely in the moment they reach the complete obstruction, which is death.
Yeah. Can I say something there? Do you think that you've said that modern people find this pretty hard to take seriously, and I guess if you put it to them in those terms, they may well. But I do think you see this played out in modern relationships very often. I don't say always, but I don't think it's that alien. It's just that people might not really understand where this all comes from. And now I'm not saying it's ubiquitous, but I do think you do get it. But it's very interesting, and I think that this whole all these ideas, this idea of love, it's come through very strongly in our culture, in people's understanding of relationships and being in love.
Yes.
This kind of thing. And you know, there's that there's that song, "You always hurt the one you love," and
Oh, yeah.
and I think, but the thing is, you see, that's just the
It's
point.
pure-
Being in love isn't really about loving the object. And I think, you know, the other person. And I think this is what really de Rougemont is getting at, because it all comes back to the Cathar idea of salvation. And de Rougemont sees that the Western idea of love as a kind of secularization or even a vulgarization of Cathar theology. And there's this statement he makes on page 308, and he says this, and I quote, "When the lover in the Manichaean legend has undergone the great ordeals of initiation, he is met, you remember, by a dazzling maiden who welcomes him with the words, 'I am thyself,'" unquote. And at another point, he talks about the narcissism involved in all of this medieval, courtly idea of love. And basically, the idea behind Cathar theology, and it was the idea behind all dualism, all the dualist heretical sects preceding that, and it goes back a long, long way. The idea is that the human soul is a divine spark trapped in a body, and salvation is escape from that body. And so, in a sense, being reunited with its true origin, its true self. So that idea, "I am thyself," that is about the Cathar idea of salvation. And what de Rougemont is saying in here, and I find this quite fascinating, is that the troubadours used this whole idea of love, courtly love, and loving from afar and all this as a metaphor for Cathar religion, or the Cathar view of salvation. But eventually that it ceased to be understood as a metaphor. Perhaps even the troubadours didn't really altogether sometimes realize it was just a metaphor, and it became taken seriously as a reality, and it became secularized, kind of, and then
it became the way that we thought about
and vulgarized. And I find this really quite fascinating. Anyway, I did interrupt you there. Do carry on if you like. I think I should say at this point, I think there's no point in me trying to get my video working, because every time I've been trying repeatedly, and every time it just stops.
That's fine.
I'm sorry about that. I'm sorry. Anyway, yeah, carry on.
We'll just go with audio then.
Yeah.
Yes. So I'd love to chat a bit more about the Cathars in a minute. De Rougemont talks about the definition of courtly love as being as being a love of love, and a love and a love that depends on passion, which is actually an old definition of passion is suffering, and like you said, it's based on a dualistic theology, which we'll talk about later about how that dualistic theology got into it. But that's why the suffering, the passion, is so important, because the love, as you see when you read the lovers in the courtly love romances, the lovers are often trying to needlessly complicate things. The whole point of their passion is that it's an unhappy passion. It's the suffering that their love causes that they're most addicted to and that they find the most valuable, because it's going to help purify them and bring them up to this unity with the divine. Which is not to say that there aren't some attractive things in the practice of courtly love. I remember reading Andreas Capellanus's rules many, many years ago when I was small, and thinking that some of them sounded pretty good, like that which a lover takes against the will of his beloved has no relish. Well, that sounds pretty manly. Or here's another one: a true lover does not desire to embrace and love anyone except his beloved. And so one of the things that struck me about it, even at the time, was that this was a lot kinder to women than a lot of what had come before.
Well, I agree with you there. And the interesting thing about this is that when Christianity came into the Greco-Roman world, it was a real liberation for women.
Yes.
And I mean, feminists talk about women's liberation today. The world has never seen since a liberation for women such as that Christianity brought for the early church. And that's why there are a lot of women in the early church, and it was immense. But it has to be said that very early on, the influence of Greco-Roman culture and ideas came into the church and corrupted it. And you can see this working itself out in many ways. And so,
in the monstrous regiment of women,
yes,
the original John Knox pamphlet.
Well, quite, and before that as well, even before that, ideas of came from the Greek world into the church and really corrupted the Christian faith to some extent. I'm not saying it corrupted it such that it wasn't there, but I think it's important to look back and understand. And it wasn't universal, but it did have quite an influence. So I think
this is a fantastic example of exactly what you're talking about. This whole courtly love subject.
Yeah.
Because I've read a lot of medieval literature, and I write literature set in medieval times, so I'm always reading the medieval literature. The reigning literary genre before courtly romances was the chanson de geste, the Song of Roland, the Song of the Cid. Those poems, well, especially not the Song of Roland. Roland doesn't have any major female characters at all, and the relationships that matter in that story are the relationships between lord and knight. The Song of the Cid has more prominent feminine roles, still revolves around that feudal lord and knight relationship. I have some in-depth articles on both of those poems on my blog, Vintage Novels. But it really struck me that it's only in Credion's romances that you start to get women as major characters in the stories with agency in the plot. And it was just eye-opening to me to read a medieval book in which you have women being valued for their intelligence or their discretion or their character, for their conversational skill, seeing them freely interact socially with men, going on quests, having friendships with each other as well as the men. It's one of the best early depictions of female characters that I've come across, and at the same time that I can see how the heresy that courtly love was based on is corrupting this and causing the women characters to be somewhat idealized and pedestalized. Even at the same time, you can see that this is a Christian heresy. This could not have come about except in a Christian context.
Well, there are a lot of things like that. Things that have gone wrong, things that are wrong, but in actual fact they're a corruption of Christian teaching, or they could only have come about because Christianity was there first, and so that's true. I agree with you.
Yeah, and I've also been thinking about, for example, the Song of Songs in the Bible is, generations of theologians have seen that as being symbolically about Christ and the church.
Spiritualized it, yeah.
Well, they do spiritualize it, but at the same time, I don't think that it's not about Christ and the church.
No, yeah.
It's about both, romantic married love and about Christ and the church, and so that shows that even from very early on in I guess you might call it the Judeo-Christian tradition, even from very on in the history of the church, we are seeing a link between writing about love and writing about faith. And
but it's interesting, isn't it? You see, I don't know if this takes us a bit wider than this discussion now, but we have the Song of Songs, which, let's face it, theologians are embarrassed about.
Oh yes.
Yeah, because it's about love, it's about sex, and they're embarrassed about that, so they've got to spiritualize it away. Yeah. But you see, I think this brings in another problem that the church has always struggled with. And the church has always struggled with sex. It's got a problem with it. If you look at throughout the history of the Christian religion, you have this problem rearing its ugly head and causing problems. And it's not there in the Bible. But I once heard somebody say this: sex is like fire. If it's in the right place, it's a real blessing. So if you've got your fire in your hearth and it's where you produce a heat in your room, it's an immense blessing. Once it gets onto the rug, you've got a real problem. It's got to be contained in its rightful place, and that is marriage. And the problem is that the church hasn't seemed to be able to cope with this very well, and so you get it going to the other real extremes, and the dualism all plays into this. For example, Clement of Alexandria, who was a mentor for Origen, he said that you should feel no real desire for your wife at all, and the wife should feel no desire for you. You should just have sex out of a logical desire to reproduce the human race. Okay, I know it sounds. Listen, I could read you some of this stuff, and it sounds utterly absurd. And the problem is, for them, there's something tainted about this, and it's not just that in the wrong place it's tainted. That is to say, in outside of marriage, but even within marriage it is. So, and affecting this is the whole thing about dualism, because it had really come badly into the church and started affecting it back then. But then you see, you cannot really suppress human nature unnaturally for long without it leading to serious problems. I mean, bad effects both personally and culturally. And that played itself out in the church. But the Cathar religion took this dualism, and you almost got a real transformation, that instead of sex being... You see, the problem with the Cathars were that theoretically they're supposed to think that sex is a bad idea, because what happens when you have sex is that a part of the divine soul, a spark of the divine soul, gets trapped in a human body. And you shouldn't... seriously, you shouldn't do this. You shouldn't do this. But you see, for them, the real problem was marriage, because that's where children are likely to be born. They had all kinds of ideas about contraception and ways of trying to stop childbirth that probably didn't work. Maybe some did, I don't know. But in actual fact, the worst kind of sex for a Cathar was marital sex. Sex outside of marriage, in their idea, was less likely to produce children and therefore less problematic. And it is simply not the case that they withdrew from having sexual relationships. What they withdrew from was sex within marriage, and this is why it was seen as such a heresy, and it was a terrible heresy. It was the worst form of heresy. Now, I don't think that justifies the way they were treated, which was, and to be quite honest, the way the Albigensian crusade was run, it was as much a land grab as anything. And
I can believe it.
It's cynical.
For the sake of our listeners, I'm not 100% caught up on exactly where the Cathars came from, but I believe that they were a heretical sect that was very prominent in the south of France around the was it 1100s, 1200s. Yeah. And then in the 1200s, the church ran a series of crusades designed to suppress them and stamp them out.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
That's correct. I mean, Languedoc, I don't know if I've said that correctly. My French pronunciation is very poor, although actually that's not French, is it? Sorry?
My French pronunciation is even worse.
I don't think it could get any worse than mine. I tend to pronounce French like Latin. I pronounce every syllable, so it doesn't work really. But the point about the Cathars was that was a particular manifestation of something which was far older. You have to go back.
Their ideas.
Manichaeism, the dualism. You got the Paulicians, the Massalians, and the Bogomils. The Bogomils were in the Balkans, and they were a dualistic sect as well.
I've heard of the Paulicians in the Balkans as well.
Yes, and the Massalians had a bad reputation for being immoral, but it's difficult to find a lot of information out about them. But certainly the Bogomils, and it's thought that the scholarly literature does have some disagreement about this, but I agree. I think it's pretty much clear that what happened was that the theology, the faith of the Bogomils moved west, and that's what the Cathars are. They are southern French flowering of that kind of dualistic theology, and it's not Christian. There are various books you can get, because they call themselves the good men, or often writers say they were good Christians. There was nothing Christian about Catharism any more than there was about Bogomilism or Manichaeism. It is a...
In fact,
go on.
In fact, I've got this quote from the medieval historian Richard Southern when he was talking about medieval romances of this period, which were, very much influenced by courtly love and that's Southern French heresy. His quote was, "The real internal religion of the heart was untouched by Christianity." And he lived, I don't think he was, he had read de Rougemont's book at all at the time that he wrote this, but he could see that the worldview that was coming out was not Christian at all.
No, it was radically unchristian. But you see, it was complicated by the fact that the church herself had bought into the whole dualist way of thinking. So that there was a level of hypocrisy when the church condemned Catharism. Now, I'm not saying it was total hypocrisy, because Catharism was very, very far removed from Christianity, despite people saying it was Christian.
What would you say are the main examples of its theology? Like, they had an interesting view on the creation of the physical universe, didn't they?
Well, their whole idea of the creation. I mean, for example, they would deny the incarnation. Jesus only appeared to be in human form. Their whole view of creation and everything is the whole dualist thing, that God, the supreme God, created spiritual beings. Those spiritual including Satan, those spiritual beings rebelled, and they created the physical world, so that everything exists it's all to do with emanations from the supreme being. It's very much linked with the whole
Gnosticism?
Yes. Well, Gnosticism, yes. Really, it's a form of Gnosticism. And Gnosticism is... the New Testament itself is very anti-Gnostic. There are places where anyone who denies that Christ has come in the flesh, that's self-consciously directed against Gnosticism. It made its influence among Christians felt very early, even in New Testament times. But it's not Christian, but it hid within the church. And the problem is that much, I don't say all, but much of that dualistic understanding of life was accepted by the church herself. And so it became a problem. How do you deal with a radical heresy like Catharism when you actually share some of its ideals? And, I read in one book, it said the real problem that the Catholic Church had with Catharism wasn't its dualism, but the fact that it feared that it would take over in the place of Catholicism. In other words, and that's why the Inquisition was so strong, that really they reacted in such a brutal manner because it was a threat to their own power base. And so you see the same things being played out over and over again in the church. It's like Jesus said, from the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of God suffereth violence and is taken by men of violence. It was all to do with power. So it was a complicated problem, but the Cathar religion itself was much more radical and consistent in its dualism, and it accepted that whole business of the physical, everything that is. He had all these emanations. Jesus didn't actually come in the flesh, and the God of the Old Testament is the God of the Old Testament is Satan, effectively, not the God and Father of the Lord Jesus Christ, and therefore.
So that harsh, unforgiving God of the Old Testament was the creator of the physical world, and he's bad, and he's they call him the demiurge, and he's like the cosmic villain of.
That's correct. And
so, what does salvation look like in such a system?
Death. That is it. Is escape from the physical world. It is reconnecting with the. You are I don't mean you really are. In this way of thinking, you are really a divine spark trapped in a human body, and your problem is not ethical, it's metaphysical. You have to escape from that body and be reunited with that divine spark. Hence de Rougemont's quoting that thing where the maiden after death says, welcome, I am thyself. In other words, and that goes to the heart of why it's so narcissistic as well.
Yes.
Oh, sorry, Susanna, I forgot now the question you just asked me then.
Oh, I asked you what salvation looked like.
Yes, sorry. It's it's escape. It's the whole dualist thing. It's escape from this world into the true spiritual world. Okay. And this is the source of all this heresy. But you see, the problem is that the church is still not free of this. Not in quite as radical a form as the Cathars had it. But it's still, in my opinion, you see, we have this problem, don't we, of all these ideas of eschatology, such as premillennialism, dispensationalism, escapism, mysticism, pietism. All these things, in my opinion, are the outcome of this basic dualistic understanding of life. And I wonder whether the real problem that's driving all this is that the church has never really dealt with the dualistic heresy properly. In my mind, it's the heresy of heresies. And not because there haven't been others, there have, but they've often been dealt with. And only particular manifestations of dualism have been dealt with by the church. And the actual idea carries on to continue corrupting. And you see, when I go to church, so many churches, I go to church and I observe what's happening today. What you've got is a form of escapism. An escapism into this spiritual realm on a Sunday morning, and everybody's waiting for when Jesus will come back and we'll all escape. In fact, I went round some years ago, about 6 years ago, I asked to go and see the pastors in the town where I lived, as many as I could. I went to talk to them about how we could, as Christians in this area, start living as a real Christian community and transform our area. And I talked about 4 issues. I talked about having a Christian education system, a Christian welfare system, a Christian arbitration system, and a Christian medical system. The last one, medical, that's quite difficult, I know. But the point is, I was saying, not how could we get together and have joint services and worship all in the same way, but how can we really be a social order that transforms the world around us? And one of the guys said to me, he said, while I was talking to him, he said, stop! Don't you know Jesus is coming back? But you see, this is it. What he's saying is, look, you're trying to polish brass on a sinking ship. And my point was, well, Jesus came to redeem this lost world. I don't think it is a sinking ship. It's our inheritance, okay? And the Bible says that God has given the whole earth to Christ as in his inheritance. But he couldn't see this, because for him, Christianity was about escaping this world. What's the point in polishing brass on a sinking ship? We are going to be taken out of this world. Now, okay, I'm not saying he was a Cathar, But what I'm saying is that the dualistic understanding of reality is at work in all that kind of thinking, and it still goes on to corrupt our understanding of the mission of the church. And I don't think that the Great Commission can be fulfilled if this isn't dealt with quite decisively. So these things, although we're talking about medieval courtly love, and it may look like a rather arcane sort of indulgence in past, it's actually not. It's highly relevant. It's highly relevant. Sorry.
Hand in hand with it's hand in hand with this whole problem of dualism that still plagues us today.
Absolutely.
Did you want to explain about how exactly so all this dualistic heretic theology wound up being embodied in courtly love? This was I think de Rougemont's most interesting insight in his book.
When I first read this book, Loving the Western World, quite some years ago, and although I knew about dualism and I'd read about that kind of thing, I read de Rougemont's book, and I found it very interesting, very intriguing, and very enlightening. But there were elements in it, and I thought, well, I'm not sure. How does that work? What is the means by which this idea of Cathar theology becomes secularized into a concept of romantic love? And I read it. I was really quite intrigued, but I can't say I fully understood it. And then I read some other books, and I read on two subjects. I read much more thoroughly on the whole history of dualism, Gnosticism, Manichaeism, all those dualistic sects that we talked about, like the Bogomils, the Cathars. But I also read a book, and I want to recommend this. I read a book called Agape and Eros by Anders Nygren. And I want to say that once I read this book and then read about the history of dualism, a lot of what de Rougemont said began to make a lot more sense, because I started to understand how that whole theology worked, that whole religion of dualism worked. And once I got to understand more of that, de Rougemont's book came much more into focus, and I could see how it worked, how this dualism passed over into a sort of a secularized form into this romantic idea of love. But it's not just... Sorry, go on.
Well, practically speaking, because Catharism was always persecuted so much, besides the fact that it was a Gnostic sect, which is all about secret salvation through secret knowledge. So if they were going to express their theology at all, and I believe it's difficult to find out about Cathar theology because it was it was supposed to be such a secret, both because of the persecutions and because it was, the whole point of it was that it was secret knowledge and you needed to be initiated into it to find out. And so really the only public way in which any of these people could communicate what they believed was in a very veiled form. And so and so they would encode it into their storytelling, and they would encode it into their poetry. And I mean, I'm an author. I encode my beliefs into my stories, and most of my stories. I don't really write poetry.
Well, that's what literature does, doesn't it?
Exactly, that's what it does.
It turns things into metaphor. And you're right, I think that's what happened with the troubadours. Now, I'm going to say something...
That was the southern French, the troubadours, as we mentioned, they're from the south of France, which was, the hotbed of Catharism. Sorry, what were you going to say? Well,
we actually do know what the Cathars believed, and one of the reasons, and when I say this, I don't want anybody to think that I am justifying this, because I am not. But in actual fact, they did eventually find out, and we have a good record of what they believed because of the Inquisition. Because the Inquisition found out. Now, I am not saying the Inquisition did right, don't get me wrong, but I'm saying there are a lot of records, and I want to recommend some books. So I'm going to try and switch my video back on and see if you can see for your Can you see that book?
Yes, it's titled Agape and Eros, and there's Nygren. That's ANDERS NYGREN.
Yeah. Okay. That was readable, was it? Yeah. Good. Well, obviously it was. You read. Now, I want to say that if you do want to read de Rougemont's book, I'm not saying you should have to read this first, but if you were to read Agape and Eros, not only would you have a real education in the whole thing about the difference between Agape and Eros and dualism and all that kind of thing, it would help you understand de Rougemont much more. I have to add, it is over 700 pages and it's a very stiff read, but it is absolutely wonderful. It's an immensely interesting book. I can't recommend it too highly, but it will help you understand the whole thing. The other books that I read were all to do with the history of dualism, but I've picked out two books that I think, if you were to read these, you would understand Catharism very well, and this would enable you to understand what de Rougemont's talking about. Now, can you read that okay? How about that?
Cathars and Catholics in a French village, got it. Yeah.
Okay, now this book is by someone called Emmanuel Leroy Ladure. My French is appalling. Sorry. But the point is, this is a social history. And this is a history of a small Cathar community in Languedoc between 1294 and 1324. And this was after the main Cathar crusade. It was the very end of the Cathar episode. But it's a social history, and he goes in to the lives of the people, what they believed, how they lived, and it's absolutely fascinating. I can't recommend it too highly, and it throws so much light onto what de Rougemont talks about. You begin to see how this whole thing worked. When I first read de Rougemont, as I say, I thought, well, okay, this is very interesting and it's utterly fascinating, but how did that work? I don't see all the connecting bits. But having read these books now, I can see the connections. I can see how it went from one to the other, and this being social history, and he relies on the transcripts of the trials and of the Inquisition, which brought much to light. Now, the other book that I want to recommend deals with exactly the same set of people, but from a historical, or rather, I should say, from a chronological point of view. Can you see that okay?
Yes, The Yellow Cross, the story of the last Cathars, 1290 to 1329. Okay,
so this deals in a sort of historical or chronological order. It's not social history, it's more traditional, telling the story. But it tells the same story about the same people as Montaillou. But not as social history, but as chronological history. And if you read those two books together, by the way, they're absolutely fascinating just to read them, to find out what it's about. It's one of the most interesting subjects, this whole thing to do with dualism, de Rougemont, Anders Nygren, one of the most interesting subjects that I've read in a long time. That would give you such a good understanding of how the whole Cathar thing worked, that it would bring into focus what de Rougemont said, and you would see what he's getting at. Now, obviously, sorry, carry on.
Well, I feel I already, you come at it from reading a lot about the Cathars. I've come at it from reading a lot of the actual courtly love literature, and I feel like that has been really helpful as well. I mean, the story I told you about Hodiana of Tripoli, this troubadour fell in love with her without having even seen her. I mean, that's a very dualistic sort of thing to do, I guess. He clearly wasn't. He was more interested in her reputation as a great beauty than as her actual existence. And I mean, who falls in love? Who really does fall in love with someone from afar, especially not in a time of mass communications? I mean,
I
he
think,
wasn't really in love with her. That was a pretty narcissistic thing to do. And then he travels east in the hopes of seeing her. He's suffering because suffering is the mode of purification and salvation in this in this whole worldview, and that suffering must eventually culminate in death. And so he his whole life culminates when he meets Hodiona and dies. And so and so it's a parable of dualistic Manichaean Gnostic Cathar theology. That's
absolutely. And had he actually met her and got to know her, things might have worked out very different. Because there's that saying, isn't there, never meet your idols. And this is a thing, almost the whole thing can presuppose us not really knowing the other person as a human being. Or it doesn't really work. And it's an ideal. It's not really about the other person at all.
No.
And so, it's very interesting. Now, you know far more about medieval literature than me. In fact, I confess my ignorance. I did start many years ago reading Le Morte d'Arthur by
Thomas Mallory.
Yeah, Mallory. Yeah, and I didn't get through it. I have to confess. It wasn't put into modern language. It was the
original Middle English.
Well, I don't. It was transliterated into modern letters, but it was hard going. But perhaps you could. What would you recommend as the? I know about the Song of Roland, but that's kind of before this, isn't it? What would you recommend as a few of the best stories to read that would give us a view of what's going on from the side of the courtly love literature?
Sure. I would recommend Chrétien de Troyes' Arthurian romances. I would recommend Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parzival. Le Morte d'Arthur is very interesting from the point of view of dualism and the whole thing about sex and marriage and all that. I actually like Mallory. I find him more orthodox than I find Chrétien.
Would you recommend reading it then in a sort of a modern translation?
Absolutely.
Yeah, because I did struggle with that. It was like trying to read the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle in Anglo-Saxon. It's virtually impossible for me.
Well, the thing that struck me about Mallory is that he is much more Christian than Chrétien is.
Well, yes, and I think because, you see, the whole Arthurian thing has a strong Christian influence, I think, as well. I'm not saying there's only the Christian influence, but it is a sort of a redemptive resurrection sort of story as well. But I think there are all these other things, so maybe I should go back and read that. But
it would be a good idea.
Yeah, I will do that. I've got a few novels I'm stuck in at the moment, but I will go and do that. Sorry, carry on.
Yeah. So one book that I have that is very helpful for understanding medieval courtly love is it's a collection of 100 Middle English lyrics, and if you just there are different collections of Middle English poetry out there, but I wanted to talk about that actually because what happened was that through the 1200s. The medieval church ran a series of crusades against the Cathars, trying to stamp them out, and it also tried to combat them in other ways. You mentioned the Inquisition. Another way was that they tried to produce cultural and literary works that would provide a something else. So, for instance, one of the things that Rougemont points out is that they fostered the cult of the Virgin Mary.
Yeah.
As an attempt to head off that heretical courtly love tradition, and so you have a lot of poetry treating the Virgin Mary almost like a courtly love object.
Yeah.
But one of the things absolutely fascinated me about this collection of Middle English lyrics is that a lot of the poems were about courtly love in a secular context, but a lot of them were also about courtly love in a religious context, where they're depicting, for example, Jesus or Mary as being courtly lovers of mankind. I thought I'd read out a stanza. This is a pretty typical stanza from one of the poems. It reads, "I crowned her." It's Christ being depicted as sighing with passion for mankind.
Right. Yeah.
And he says, "I crowned her with bliss, and she me with thorn. I led her to chamber, and she me to die. I brought her to worship, and she me to scorn. I did her reverence, and she me villainy. To love one who loves is no mastery. Her hate made never my love her foe. Ask then no more questions why, but thus I swoon for love." So when I first read these songs about 4 years ago, it struck me as strange, even at the time, that instead of Christ dying to redeem and purify himself a bride, you have Christ going through this passion for basically humanity as this fickle, courtly love mistress.
Yeah.
It was theologically very weird.
Yeah, I can see that. That's very interesting. I'd never come across that before. But as I say, I'm not that well read on the literature side of it. Well, I'm not well read at all, apart from my one foray into Le Morte d'Arthur. But you can see how that they're trying to do something about it. But you see, this is the problem very often. Even when the church realises a problem, they go about it in the wrong way to correct it, and get involved with the very thing that they're supposed to be trying to deal with.
One thing that Rougemont points out, and he says over and over in his book, is that the Christian ideal of marriage isn't supposed to be angst-ridden and tormented, and the whole distinctive, the distinctive element of the courtly love tradition is that it's supposed to be never-ending torment.
Yeah.
And so what they've done in these sort of in these courtly love religious lyrics is that they've depicted Christ as pretty much eternally suffering.
Yeah. Interesting. And I wonder how that works. I'm just thinking off the top of my head now. I wonder how that works with the whole idea that you very often get among Christians. The idea that Christ has conquered and risen from the grave and ascended is not quite seen as... it's not as important to see this whole idea of the suffering Christ. Of course, don't get me wrong, Christ had to suffer for us to be redeemed. But there's almost, sometimes there's almost a kind of a wallowing in the concept of suffering. I mean, I have had Christians say to me, "Oh, suffering is good for you." Suffering itself. And I remember saying this, I said, well, not for its own sake. Suffering's good if it's for a reason. So, for example, if we, through the sacrifice of obedience, suffer persecution for Christ, that's a sacrifice of obedience, and that's a good thing, and that's a testimony to the faith. But this guy said to me, he said, "No, suffering is good for you. Just to suffer is good for you." I said, "No." I call
that another outcropping of the of the dualism that you've been talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I said to this guy, I said, "Well, I don't agree with you. I don't see that the Bible teaches that." And when Jesus came across suffering, he always tried to heal it. When he came across people who were ill, who were suffering, he didn't say, "Oh, that's good for you. Just hang on a bit more in there. You'll die in the end and then you'll be saved." He didn't do that. He healed them wherever Jesus found suffering, and he came to heal. Now, it is true that we, through much tribulation, we enter the kingdom of God. But I think that's different. That's the sacrifice of obedience. And it may be that we have to go through things that we find painful in order to learn things in order to be
Yes.
but there's always a purpose to that. It's not suffering.
Yes.
It's not suffering for its own sake. It's not because I once went to a house group in this church, and they started talking about going to heaven. And this lady said, "Oh, death's the most natural thing in the world. I'm looking forward to it." And I said, "That's not, seriously." I said, "That's not Christian." She said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, death is the curse for sin. Salvation is in Christ, and our destination is the resurrection, not heaven. There's
definitely been a tradition within the Christian church of seeing death as that Gnostic release from the tribulations of the material fallen world.
That's correct. And she this all goes back, of course, to the Greco-Roman perspective, what Anders Nygren calls the Alexandrian worldview, that really escape from the physical world is what salvation is all about. And this has infected the church very strongly. And this lady had some very interesting, bizarre ideas, I have to say. She liked children, and that's fine. I mean, there's nothing wrong with liking children. But she said, "I'm looking forward to heaven." And she said about she's going to love being with all the children in heaven. And I said, "Well, I'm sorry, but there's going to be no children in heaven." and I said, "And it's not heaven, it's the resurrection, and there won't be any children." And she said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, who's going to volunteer to be a child for eternity? Who's going to volunteer to be a child in the resurrection? And even if you're there as a child, I mean, and this is speculation, but you're going to grow up. It just doesn't make sense." So her idea of things was, and she said, she said, "I don't want to be there if there's not going to be children there. That's terrible." But you see how illogical, this all throws up how illogical the whole idea of salvation is, and how much it's formed, not by what the Bible teaches, but by almost folk religion. You get this kind of, and you even get it here in the Church of England, in the churches in the villages. I went to a village church one time, and it was a C of E, and they prayed for the dead. And you don't usually hear that in the C of E, but they prayed for the dead. Well, I don't. Anyway, and a friend of mine said, "Why do you do that?" And this guy said, "Well, the dead are all around us, looking after us." This isn't Christianity by any stretch of the imagination. So all these things come into the church, all these pagan ideas are still in the church, and it's like a folk religion. And the dualism is one really strongly component of that whole folk religion idea. And the lady I was talking about, who wanted to go to heaven and thought death was the most natural thing in the world, she was an evangelical, though, and which is different to the people in the village church who thought the dead was all around them looking after them, and that's different. But even there, it was very strong. And so it seems to me that the church has to deal with this whole problem of dualism, because I think what reading de Rougemont and those other books have led me to realise is that this is not just one among many problems. It's a very far-reaching, really serious problem that affects a lot of things. I mean, even because it's affected our culture generally, it affects other things. If you go to you know what I mean by a GP, your physician.
Yes.
You go to your general practitioner. The medical model there of a human being is basically dualistic. You've got your mechanical bits, the bits you can make better by doing the bits of plumbing and internal plumbing and this kind of thing, and then you've got the mental bit, and somehow the two are not connected. And the whole medical model works on this. Now, it is getting better, and I have to say that there is a realisation that it doesn't work like that. Unfortunately, the model they're developing isn't a Christian model, but they do realise that model is problematic. But that whole model was based on the dualistic perspective, and it's informed the West's understanding of medical things. I was also interested in de Rougemont, and I'm still trying to figure this out because I know you've mentioned it as well. He brings this whole thing of suffering even into war and totalitarianism and things like that.
Yes,
and
I thought that was fascinating.
Yes, I do.
If I could jump in there, I mean, in the towards the end of the book, he really digs into a lot of things, a lot of ways that he believes that that this whole courtly love idea, the courtly love myth, has impacted us throughout history down to the current day. And I had some disagreements with him in that section. And it's, you were talking about the necessity of keeping our eyes on the eschatological reality that after suffering, our suffering is we suffer towards a specific goal, and we're not going to suffer forever. Suffering is very much a limited experience for a purpose. We don't suffer for the sake of suffering or for the sake of being liberated from the physical world. I did think that de Rougemont almost overstated that a little bit. It seemed when he was going over literature and talking about literature that he was almost assuming that whenever you see suffering in literature, or the course of true love failing to run smooth, that would have to be an effect of the courtly love myth. As a fiction author myself, I had a lot of objections to that. For example, I think as we've talked a bit about, suffering does have a place in the Christian life, and one of the most important events that we've labelled passion is Christ's passion on the cross. So obviously that passion is the template of all other passions. And so Rougemont spends so much time talking about the false version of passion, the version that has no arrival point in the physical world. Christianity does have that arrival point in the physical world, but he spends very little time talking about the fact that this false passion actually comes from a true passion, and it's the true passion behind all the heresy that is often also at work in our literature and culture.
Now, I'm not sure I agree with you there, but I wouldn't be too dogmatic about this. There is a false passion and there is the true passion, I agree. But I'm not sure that... He doesn't say that the false passion is a corruption of the true passion, does he? Or do you think he does? I mean, I think he's saying they're totally different things, that Christ's passion, if you like, the true passion, the passion that saves, that delivers us, is of a completely different order, really. And I think this is where reading I think
Nygren, Augustinian presuppositions may be shown.
Well, when I read Nygren's book, what it made me realise is the immense difference between Agape and Eros, and Agape religion and Eros religion. Now, when I say Eros, I don't mean simply sex, and because we have the word erotic, it's often taken that way. But that was only one minor aspect. It's not minor. One aspect of Eros. The whole idea of Eros is, now I can't do this. Let me try and get my video going again. The whole idea of Eros is this: man's search upwards.
Right.
And outwards. In other words, to better himself, to go there, he never looks back to those who he can help, but he's seeking to better himself and move beyond. So this is Eros religion, but this is Agape religion. God coming down and transforming this world, and this is what
incarnational.
Yes. Now, that's not to say that Eros necessarily is always wrong, and Anders Nygren doesn't say that, but you can characterize, if you like, Christian religion as compared with non-Christian religion. Fundamentally, in these terms, a difference between Agape religion and Eros religion. And I think this plays into what de Rougemont is talking about, because you see the Cathar, the dualistic faith, is supremely Eros religion. It's man escaping, bettering himself, going up there. It's man's transformation up there into the divine. Christianity is I'm trying to get this thing. Sorry. Christianity is the opposite. Christianity is God coming down here and transforming. And that's why I say this background to it all really made me understand much more what the issues that de Rougemont is dealing with. It made me understand them, because this really is the difference. And you see this even in the church. Much of the Christianity that we have adopts much of this Eros idea of, going up and transforming, not the idea of God coming down here in the incarnation and because the Cathars and the Gnostics reject the incarnation completely. It's a real anathema to them. But God incarnate, and we are in our we are to incarnate the religion.
You can see how desperately important it is for agape-based religion, for Orthodox Christianity, that there should be an arrival point in the physical creation.
Yeah.
I was thinking about how the courtly love myth may or may not have become involved in our culture today, and I was thinking about the modern day romance genre, to go from the very esoteric to the to the somewhat ridiculous,
from the sublime to the ridiculous. Yeah, okay.
So one of the definitive tropes of romance genre fiction today is the happily ever after. Basically, you can't write romance fiction unless your couple winds up with a long-term happy ending at the end of it. De Rougemont talks about this as being a vulgarization or profanation of the heresy of courtly love. Well, I would be tempted to say that it's orthodoxy breaking back in.
I agree with you there. I absolutely agree with you there, Susanna. You're right. Sorry, I interrupted you. Carry on.
Yeah. So, it's not. De Rougemont would refer to this as sort of a crowd-pleasing, decadent variation of the heresy of courtly love, but it's actually a denial that suffering is an end in itself.
I agree with you there. I do agree with you, because I think, and the interesting thing is, I think you see that kind of, and it can be quite, that sort of, riding off into the sunset type ending can sometimes be a bit sort of wooden and that. But I do agree with you. And I think you see it more in American and British cinema, for example, than you do in continental cinema, where existentialism is much more common, and there is no proper ending, and where Christianity it has had more of effect in recent times. We find some frustration with those kinds of things. Say, well, it hasn't ended. Well, it hasn't ended, and that's a similar kind of thing. So I think you're right there, and I think those cultures that are more Christian tend to gravitate towards, if you like, the riding off into the sunset ending, than those that have lost more Christianity. What do you think about that? I mean, that's just a... I don't know, maybe that's...
I would have to think about it a bit more in order to make it... It wouldn't surprise me. I was thinking about a couple of different real-life historical love affairs.
Oh, yeah.
Though. So, for instance, an example of the kind of thing that I'm talking about would be J.R.R. Tolkien and his romance with Edith Bratt, and I would call that a great example of Orthodox Christian passion, because what happened was that Tolkien fell in love with Edith as a teenager, and then he was forbidden to see her by his guardian. He waited for several years, I forget exactly how long, 3 or 5 years, and he waited until he was permitted to see her again. And in his letters, he later said that he believed that it was this time of suffering that transformed his rather callow puppy love into the kind of love that could be the foundation of a long and happy marriage. So his passion had a very practical and earthly result.
Yeah.
But there's another historical love affair that just completely blew my mind. I was doing a little bit of research, a little bit more brushing up on it while I was reading the Rougemont book, and it was this more than anything else that convinced me that de Rougemont actually had a point. So I'm a huge fan of the pre-Raphaelite artists, especially the poet Christina Rossetti. And one of the most important of the pre-Raphaelites was Christina's brother, Dante Gabriel Rossetti. And he had a famous love affair with his model and student Lizzie Siddall. Now, he became obsessed with her, and he drew or painted her, hundreds or thousands of times over the course of a relationship that lasted many years. Her health was very bad, and she was growing more and more sickly, and she became addicted to laudanum and had all sorts of terrible health problems. We have one description of her from a family friend who described her as thinner and more death-like and more beautiful and more ragged than ever. And yet, despite all this, Rossetti continued to draw her in this really idealized and unchanging way. They became engaged fairly early on, but for 10 years they kept on putting off their marriage. This was something that the rest of the Rossetti family couldn't understand, why they would keep on putting off their marriage. And it wasn't until his obsession with her had sort of already ended and he was seeing other models that they finally did marry. And they were only married for a couple of years. It wasn't going terribly well. And finally Lizzie accidentally, or actually we don't know whether it was an accident or suicide, but she overdosed on laudanum. And one writer that I was looking at recently in my own library was saying that Lizzie's death simply marked the midpoint of the love affair. Because what happened afterwards is that Rossetti was, he put on this big show of an extravagant grief. He buried all of his poems in Lizzie's coffin. He painted her as Dante's Beatrice, who, Rossetti had named himself after the original poet Dante, who wrote wrote the Divine Comedy that was very much influenced by this whole medieval courtly love idea. Years later, Rossetti decided that he wanted to publish the poems that he'd buried with his wife, so he dug up her coffin. It was a public sensation, and witnesses claimed that Lizzie's body hadn't decayed and her famous red hair had continued to grow after her death. So it all became this great sort of legendary Victorian love story. Yeah. And I was just staggered by how well de Rougemont's courtly love myth explains this whole relationship.
It fits well, doesn't it? Yeah.
The pre-Raphaelites were huge medieval fanboys, and it makes perfect sense that if anyone was going to reproduce a medieval courtly love relationship in his own life, it would have been Dante Gabriel Rossetti. And after reading de Rougemont, I realised that's exactly what he did. I mean, you have this 10-year-long engagement where they were continually coming up with obstacles to the marriage. You had Lizzie's suffering and declining health, which everybody thought was so artistic and aesthetic.
Aesthetic, yes. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, and finally, she did the perfect thing. She died tragically young, and and that became the ultimate consummation of their passion. Yeah,
I mean that really is a good example of what he's talking about. But the Tolkien doesn't fit that at all, does it?
No,
it fits a Christian model of in other words, it ends in a good marriage, which the medieval passion thing can't fit because it's incompatible with it. And I think that's very good. Those are two very good examples of it today. Although the Rossetti thing was a while back, yes I know, but they're very good examples. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, and I was thinking of those as good examples of how the courtly love myth has and hasn't affected us since. And I think de Rougemont makes wonderful points when he says that totalitarianism and war are examples of passion today, where the totalitarian state requires a collective passion, a collective suffering from people.
Yeah. I read that, and I'm still trying to figure that out. How does that work? I'm not saying it's not so, but I'm still trying to figure that out quite, if you like, all the connecting bits with that. Maybe you could help me. I don't know how do you. Yeah.
Oh, I just read the book very quickly and thought, ooh, that's interesting.
It does. It throws up lots of interesting things that make you think, and it makes you think, how does that work through? And it can take a while sometimes to think these things through.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He also says that you see the influence of courtly love in serial monogamy, where people today often go through a succession of spouses on this never-ending search for happiness.
Yes.
Because a lot of people today are agnostic about life after death, they're not seeking a mystic achievement in death.
No.
So instead, they're sort of seeking personal happiness, which results in serial infidelity.
Yeah.
And
because it can never end in an happy marriage. So that you move on to the next. This is what you're saying.
The reason it can never end in a happy marriage, I think, is because they're looking to love, to provide something that love doesn't actually provide. Not in God's world.
No. So they're making an idol out of it. And
that's exactly how I would sum it up.
The problem with idols is they can never deliver what they promise, but they're always tyrants that crush men's spirits and enslave them. Idols always fail, but in the process they enslave men and crush their spirits. That's how I think it works, and they destroy the real meaning of life.
And that's what I really think that the ultimate effect of medieval courtly love on our society today and the way that we think about love is this whole idea that love ought to be this transformative, transcendent, quasi-religious, mystical experience.
Yeah.
And it can't produce that. I mean, here's a quote from Ernest Hemingway, which I dug out of a Rushdoony book. He writes, one of his characters is saying, "I'm not ambitious, Molly, of place or power or riches, but of knowledge and wisdom. I'm the lover and priest. I don't want happiness even, Molly, nor comfort, though I'll take all I can get of both. I'm wedded to one quest, like a knight of the Holy Grail, and my whole life will go to the achievement." And what is this quest for? It's for, and I quote, "the everlasting empire of love."
Yeah.
And so I really believe that this is the attitude underpinning the absolute ubiquity of romantic love as a theme in films or pop songs or novels. Sure, I mean, I'm an author myself, and it makes sense to write about love because everyone's so interested in it. Everyone has usually experienced it in some way or another. It's one of those universal experiences that we can all understand, so it's a great thing to write about. But there are other things in life. There are other things in life that can deeply move us beside romantic love. And as part of this whole this idolization of love, we have this idea that romantic love is somehow more important than other kinds of love.
Yeah, and in a way, you see, I think when we're talking about this romantic love, we use the same word love, but being in love isn't the same thing as loving somebody. And that's what's so interesting about what de Rougemont says, how narcissistic being in love is, and how it's not really about the other person. It's not loving that other person. It's a narcissistic. It's almost a narcissistic self-love, really. And so we fail to have in some respects, our vocabulary makes it difficult for us to think clearly about it, because we talk about loving somebody, we talk about being in love, but being in love can lead you to, or it perhaps is itself. It's not the same thing as loving somebody, and a successful marriage is about loving each other. It's not about narcissism and self-fulfillment in that sense. Sorry, you were going to say something.
Oh, I think one of the classic blunders in love these days is, maybe always, is the mistake of thinking that if you feel good when you're around someone, that must be that you love them.
Yeah.
Well, no, love has more to do with laying down your life for the other person.
Yeah.
And wanting the other person, not wanting to be around that person because of how you feel when you're out about them, but wanting that person to be most themselves. Yeah.
Which again brings us back to the difference between Agape and Eros to some extent. Because they're types of love that work in completely opposite directions.
One idea I had while I was putting together my thoughts for this episode, I think it's very noteworthy that it isn't love, which Paul says is a mysterious picture of Christ and the church. Yeah. It's marriage.
Yeah, absolutely.
So if anything is a quasi-religious experience, which I think gets over. I think the identification of marriage with Christ and the church gets a little bit overemphasized in some areas.
I agree.
Of the church.
I mean, there are other metaphors that the Bible uses as well. But I agree.
Well, it gets overemphasized to the point where we almost make the husband into Christ himself.
Yeah.
But
yes, I agree with you. And sometimes that metaphor is it's misused sometimes, in my opinion, and made more of than actually the Bible does. And sometimes some of the passages are misquoted, and I'm just trying to think where it is now. But we're going off the point a bit. I think it's in Galatians, and I can't just bring it up off the top of my head. But sorry, carry on. I agree with you.
Too many fascinating rabbit trails on this subject.
Oh, absolutely.
Because it really does touch everything, doesn't it?
I think this whole thing is pervasive, but we don't always realise how pervasive. And I think that things are so connected, and the more connected you see things, the more difficult it is to really explain them in some ways. But I do think this this whole thing has it has a very wide effect. And it has a greater effect than we realise. I find it very fascinating, and I think it is highly relevant. I think it's highly relevant to the world generally, and to Christians specifically. It's relevant to non-Christians specifically as well. But it is relevant, and I think we do need to do more thinking about it. And I think the church does as well. Though I have to confess, it's difficult to get many Christians thinking about anything. I have to say, I do find that to be the case. But it's a fascinating subject, and I'm not by no means have I learned everything about it. I'm still learning, and there's still more I want to learn. And actually, reading de Rougemont's book a second time, there was a lot that I understood more because of what I'd read in the meantime. But there's also a lot that I realise now. I've only scratched the surface, and I need to know more. And this is a frustration. I mean, we are finite beings, aren't we? And we want to know more than it's probably possible to know in a lifetime. But it is fascinating, and I think it's a subject that, if we understood, can help us to understand how we can change things for the better. Yeah,
well, it certainly sparked a lot of thoughts in me. We're getting we're coming up on 1.5 hours of talking.
Oh, all right, yeah. Okay.
Unfortunately.
No.
So I might wrap up there.
That's fine. That's fine.
Any concluding comments that you really wanted to make sure you got in, Stephen?
Well, I think that my concluding comments are: if you really love reading, try and read the Anders Nygren and the other books on that I recommended on the Cathars first, because it will prepare you for de Rougemont's book. But it is a lot of reading, and I understand that. So if you can't do that, don't let it put you off reading de Rougemont's book, because it is a fascinating read, and it will stimulate you, and you'll learn a lot, and you may then want to read more and afterwards about the Cathars and dualism, and it will bring it into perspective. So don't let the fact that I've recommended those books put you off, that I've recommended you read them first, put you off reading de Rougemont's book. Just read de Rougemont's book. It's just that they will help so much to put it into perspective. And I think that's what I'd say to conclude.
Excellent. Thank you. So if you want to read Love in the Western World, you can actually get it in PDF format from the Internet Archive under the title Passion and Society. And I might have a look on Internet Archive myself for Anders Nygren's book Agape and Eros. I just wanted to finish it off by reading out some of these amazing one-liners that I found towards the end of the book. I'm going to quote: "Once Eros ceases to be a god, it also ceases to be a demon. Everything European is not Christian. Rape and polygamy deprive a woman of her equality by reducing her to sex." Or regarding the pedestalization and idealization of women in courtly love, he says, "Once she is man's equal, woman cannot be man's goal." I really enjoyed some of those quotes.
Yeah, they're very good. They're very good. Yes, excellent. Yeah.
Oh, well, thank you so much for joining me tonight, Stephen.
Well, it's morning for me. Thank you very much. I've enjoyed it. It's been good fun, and thank you very much for talking about this. I've really enjoyed it. It's a fascinating subject, and
it really, really is.
Thank you for listening to The Monstrous Regiment. We hope this podcast inspires and equips you to go and exercise dominion for Christ's kingdom, terrible as an army with banners. The Reconstructionist Radio Podcast Network brings to you a complete lineup of podcasts where you will hear practical and tactical theology. Our desire is not simply that you consume our shows, but that you also live out your faith in every area of life. We can talk all day long about these things, but if we fail to put them into practice, then we fail as ambassadors of Jesus Christ, our King. Subscribe now to your favorite Reconstructionist Radio Podcast Network shows, or you can subscribe to the Reconstructionist Radio Master Feed, where all of the content we produce, including the audiobooks and audio articles, will pop up as soon as they are available. And don't forget to visit reconstructionistradio.com to volunteer as a narrator or to partner with this ministry financially. May the Holy Spirit stir you into action for Christ and His kingdom